Statistics Canada has just released the latest unemployment figures for October, and they show a jump in job creation, 108,000 new jobs in October, 10 times what many economists had expected. But ironically, the good news is fueling fears that the economy is overheating, that inflation has become entrenched, and that, as most observers say, Canada is heading into a recession. To look at it all, I'm joined by Pedro Antunes. He is the Chief Economist at the Conference Board of Canada, and Jim Stanford, who is an economist and the Director of the Centre for the Future of Work. Both of you, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Martin.
Welcome.
Okay, let's start with it. I mean, I think a lot of Canadians are trying to get their head around the fact that we have historically low unemployment figures, including this surge in unemployment creation this month, and yet it spells potentially bad news in terms of inflation and higher interest rates. Pedro Antunes, start us out by explaining to the average Canadian what that means.
Yeah, well, essentially what we're facing, I think, is very much a supply-constrained economy. You know, we keep hearing from the bank and from federal finance as well, the Bank of Canada, that is, that we're above capacity. And when we say that, I really think we're above capacity in terms of the labor market. If you talk to many employers in Canada today, they're desperately looking for workers because they can't satisfy the demand that's out there for their product. So I don't think it's bad news necessarily that we've seen job creation. Yeah. But what I'm suggesting is that a very tight labor market with the unemployment rate in Canada at record lows, that is a sign that essentially we can start to see inflationary pressures come up. And it's not so much that we don't want to see wages catch up with inflation, and that is happening. In fact, in some provinces, wages have outpaced inflation. That's not necessarily bad news on its own. The problem is if those wage increases aren't reflected in productivity, then they just end up, with another round of price increases from employers, and we end up back into the 1980s with a spiral of inflation. So this is the challenge that I think monetary authorities are facing today.
Okay, Jim Stanford, what do you make of it? I mean, the suggestion is that this very, very low unemployment rates are going to fuel the central bank's intent to continue to hike inflation rates. And we're seeing the result that we're heading into a recession caused by the monetary policy.
Well, at least the good news, Martin, today was that recession clearly hasn't started yet. Yeah. And I was worried that it had. But wow, 100,000 new jobs is a sign that we've still got some momentum. And I am still of the old school that the more people are out there working, producing, generating income, paying taxes, that is good news. And the only reason people think it's bad news is because we've somehow been sucked into this upside down idea that Canadians have too much work. This is the underlying assumption of the Bank of Canada's argument that the labor market is overheated. I absolutely reject that. We still have 5.2% unemployment. That's about where it was in 2019 before the pandemic, and we didn't have a wage price spiral in 2019. Wages are growing in nominal terms at around 5%. It's a little bit less than that when you adjust for quality and composition, more like 4%. And that is still way behind consumer price inflation. So real wages, the actual cost of labor in economic terms, is falling, not rising. So all of this suggests we've still got room to grow. It's only someone who's unduly focused on wages and workers as the source of inflation, which I don't think describes what's happened, who could see this possibly as bad news. Okay, well then a question though, in a word to both of you and each of you, the Bank of Canada Governor, Tiff Macklem, has said that he counts on plural, more interest rate hikes coming up. Are we headed inevitably, though, to a recession? Pedro Antunes.
Well, I think, if you look at most of the forecasts that are out there right now, they're essentially calling for a very similar scenario, whether they define it as a recession or not. What we're looking at for most forecasters, including, what the Bank of Canada put out just recently and what we saw from the economic update yesterday, it's essentially flat growth for 2 or 3 quarters. Some forecasters have a couple of minor declines in there. That means technical recession for some. Okay. In my view, these aren't recessions. These are essentially the successful monetary policy scenario where for all of those forecasts, what you see is the economy slows down, inflation starts to come down, and by the time we get to 2024, and by the way, that includes our own forecast at the Conference Board, but by the time we get to 2024, inflation is back in check in that 2 to 3% range. I think the risk, however, is that we do see inflationary pressures continue, and that could be internal. I certainly see Jim's point, but I do think that if wages continue to catch up with inflation, we will get into this spiral where it's very hard to beat back domestic inflationary pressures. But that's one issue. Of course, there's the geopolitics too, and we could very easily end up with another round of commodity price shocks here. So any of these things could trigger a tougher stance or a tougher time for monetary authorities to bring down inflation, higher interest rates. We're extremely leveraged in this country, lots of debt for households, and that could spell a much harder landing, I think, further down the road.
Okay, Jim Stanford, rightly or wrongly, in terms of the Bank of Canada's hiking of interest rates, do you think we are inevitably headed for a recession, if you want to call it that or not? And I'd like to get your reflections on what was in the economic update and whether the measures, for example, for giving student interest on loans and this expansion of the workers' benefit, the Canada workers' benefit, whether they will come as any help. Are we going to be in a recession, in a word? And the measures we saw in the economic update?
We will be in a recession next year. I'm surprised by today's news and gladdened by it, but the overall trend is still very negative, not just from our own interest rates, but from those around the world and the other adjustments from the pandemic and the shock. So I think that is a given. In terms of the fiscal and economic statement, it was, I think, quite cautious and quite conservative. There is this idea that the government is still throwing money around because they have a deficit. Not so. In fact, program spending from the government has fallen very sharply over the last 2 years, including in the current fiscal year, and future increases are not even going to keep up with population growth and inflation. So the measures that were there, that workers' benefit, for example, for low-income workers, good ideas, targeted, but I think we're going to need more of that if and when the economy does go into a recession. Okay,
Pedro Antunes, we only have a few seconds left. Your reaction to the measures that were announced by Minister Freeland yesterday, specifically those targeted measures on student loans, on workers' benefits, and on those two major points.
Yeah, no, I would agree. We are trying to ease the pain on those that suffer most from inflation, and I think those measures were targeted and relatively light. So not adding to that problem that the Bank of Canada is trying to fight. Too much stimulus or too much fervor in the economy, if you'd like. I'd also like to point out that there was what I would suggest very few measures in terms of stimulating the other part of the economy, which is private investment, and I think we need to do more on that front as well.
Okay, both of you, thank you very much. We will no doubt have a chance to speak again as we monitor this and as we watch the trends. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
You're welcome.